having talked last week about how a Stuart person would keep themselves clean and keep themselves smelling good and things like that, we can then look to the things that they actually deliberately add to themselves in order to make themselves look even better by their standards of beauty, of course. Now, this sort of thing does not go completely unchallenged. As in any era, more or less, you ask the Romans, you ask anybody, you'll find that there are people saying, that it's cheating and wrong to give yourself all these extra makeups, and you're probably just in it to lure men or something like that. Yeah, that idea that you might be doing it under false pretenses, or you might be showing your true nature, is very common. So there's even an Elizabethan law that says any woman who through the use of false hair, Spanish hair pads, makeup, false hips, steel busks, panniers, high-heeled shoes or other devices leads a subject of Her Majesty into marriage shall be punished with the penalties of witchcraft. How dare you make yourself look like someone that you're not? You can do it in order to get the attention in the first place, but if you can keep the pretense up long enough to marry them, well, that's quite impressive. And that could happen. There's an actual letter in the Spectator from 1711, so that's a good 150 years after this act, which is from a husband, a new husband, who is asking the advice column, basically, in the Spectator, what is the law about when a man marries a woman and finds her not to be what she is purporting to be? Can he get a separation? And does that apply within his case? Because normally that would be things like she claimed to have a lot of money and she didn't, or she claimed a title and she didn't have one. In this case, he's saying, not to keep you in suspense, as for my dear, never man was so enamoured as I was of her fair forehead, neck and arms, as well as the bright jet of her hair. But to my great astonishment, I find that they were all the effect of art. Her skin is so tarnished with this practice that when she first wakes in a morning, she scarce seems young enough to be the mother of her whom I carried to bed the night before. That's a pretty good trick with the makeup, isn't it? To get a whole generation or more out of it. You certainly could do a lot. There's a character in a Marston play who says, do you know Dr. Plasterface? By this curd, he is the most exquisite in forging of veins, sprightening of eyes, dyeing of hair, sleeking of skins, blushing of cheeks, surfling of breasts, blanching and bleaching of teeth, that ever made an old lady gracious by torchlight. See, it's a useful trick, and therefore to be suspected, possibly even of being a form of witchcraft. And Puritans, obviously in the early and mid 17th century, are very much against this sort of thing. They tell you that if you cheat with your appearance, there's a fair chance that you might also cheat on your husband. Pepys gives a case of this kind of thing. He mentions gossip that his mother-in-law has produced, and she's complaining that while her son is at war, her son's wife is staying out late and painting in the absence of her husband. And by painting here, we do not mean painting beautiful pictures. We mean, of course, painting their face. And painting their face while their husband is out of town. The Puritans are so much against it that they try another parliamentary bill, not just for if you happen to lure someone into marriage, but in general terms, if you try and disguise your appearance too much. They consider a bill which calls for the suppression of the vice of painting, wearing black patches, and the immodest dress of women. But it's soon realised that it's actually deeply impractical to try to have a bill that prevents all of that, and it gets dropped. In fact, the 1650s, which you would expect would be a time of nobody doing this sort of thing, in fact, some people seem to start taking it up. I don't know, maybe that's some sort of minor act of rebellion. The diarist Evelyn in 1654, who is fairly moderate in his Puritan ways compared to some, says, I now observed how the women began to paint themselves, formerly a most ignominious thing and used only for prostitutes. it does become a bit more normalised after the Restoration. There is a big resurgence in fashion, and also all the nobles who've been staying over in France during the Commonwealth period come back over and bring some quite Frenchified fashions with them. And particularly amongst the men, you start getting a particular French fop look, which is something new that involves a lot of powdered curls and perfumed gloves and things like that. And those things do influence further down the social spectrum, but it takes a little while for that to happen. Another writer of the time says that, you know, you can't win either way. English ladies seem to have borrowed some of their cosmetical conceits from barbarous nations, are seldom known to be contented with the face of God's making. They are either adding, detracting, or altering continually, having many creams in readiness for the same purpose. Sometimes they think they have too much colour, and then they use art to make them look pale and fair. And now they have too little colour, and then Spanish paper, red leather, or other cosmetical rubriges must be had. There's even a whole new word which was used for all of this, which I think would be brilliant to bring back. And it comes from the Dutch, and it's a word for preening and touching one's look in the mirror. And they did have little, you get the first little glass pocket mirrors at this point. They're very expensive, they come from Venice. But silver-backed glass is a thing, and the whole sort of, just checking, is called sprunking. So I think that's a word we could reasonably bring back. That oh, she's just sprunking in the mirror again. And of course, this thing about is my face too pale or too red just shows what their whole look was all about, because it is all about this sort of very pale white face with rosy cheeks on it, to a greater or lesser degree of comedy, depending on who you're looking at. Some portraits are just ridiculous. And you obviously start by not going out in the sun too much. You might carry a parasol, or some rich ladies even wore a mask when they went out into the sun to keep the sun from their faces. And you want it to look like you haven't been working out in the sun. And you want to look like you don't have these smallpox scars that about 10% of the population have, or even worse, scars that could be perceived as being a mark of having venereal disease, because that can damage your face as well. This is obviously a bad thing. And the fashionable option is to use Ceruse. Now, Ceruse comes from lead. There's a couple of different chemical compounds you can use, but they're all lead based. You buy a powder, you mix it with water or with egg white, and you dab it on with a cloth. And it does apparently give you a really nice sort of even white coverage without having to put very much on. And it's very good. And also the fact it comes from Venice and is very expensive is also, of course, a very positive thing for some people. However, it was popular in Roman times, went away again, did a comeback in the time of Queen Elizabeth, and continues on for a few hundred years from there. However, white lead and the alternative one, which is a mercury-based thing, chloride of mercury, both damage the health. They both primarily actually damage your face, or damage whatever skin you've put them on. It's incredibly drying and kind of eats away at your skin. It's not a nice thing. People at the time did know that. Thomas Tuke writes, "The women who often paint themselves with it, though they be very young, they presently turn old with withered and wrinkled faces like an ape." Which is not a look you'd probably be going for deliberately. Restoration playwright William Wycherley says, "Betwixt the pomatum and the Spanish red, which is the colour of the skin, and the Spanish red on the cheeks, she has a complexion like a Holland cheese," like a Gouda with all the holes in. It would also tend to make your eyebrows thin and eventually fall out. And if you put it up here, it's actually going to start moving your hairline back because it's damaging your hair follicles. And if you think of pictures of Queen Elizabeth or other pictures of ladies at that time, quite a lot of them do have a very high hairline. And that might be because, or partially because, they've accidentally taken their own hairline back with all the white powder they've been using. There are other options, of course. You can use a whole load of things. Rice powder, ground plaster, talcum powder, bismuth, which is a white powder with quite a metallic shine to it, but again, it's not very good for you. Borax and sulphur, which again is very drying and slightly yellow, which you wouldn't think was necessarily particularly helpful. One very expensive and exclusive option, which is actually apparently still used in makeup today, was pearl powder. You could dissolve pearls in lemon juice and then it would dry out, and obviously as it had dissolved it would become very, very, very fine, and then as it dries out you're left with sort of crushed pearls. And if you put those on, apparently it has a very slight whitening effect, but also because of the nacre in the pearl, it has a very slight sheen to it, which tends to sort of even out your skin tone. And yeah, makeup today, expensive makeup today, still sometimes contains pearl powder. Another thing you could potentially do before or instead of all of that would be to put egg white on your face, which again sounds a bit weird, but the poet Taylor says some young ladies, their faces garnish, which makes they look like visors or new varnish. Because literally it's going to be like a mask of egg white on your face. It will hold down whatever else is on there, the powder, but it does mean that if you move your mouth, your face too much, it's literally going to crack and leave lines. Very, very weird idea. And then of course you have to add your red on your cheeks, and you could do it the subtle way if you were so inclined. There are these sort of recipes for things that are like halfway between a dye and a face pack, something that's just got a bit of colour in it. Might be something like madder or alkanet or even saffron, which is going to obviously make it a bit more orangey colour. And it would be a bit like hennaing yourself. It would be very bright the first day and then it would gradually fade off over several days. Or you can start with one of the white powders and add something bright. So mercuric sulfide is known as vermilion and gives you a very bright, or Brazil wood or cochineal beetles crushed up and bound in gum arabic. And a lot of these are exactly the same things that the Romans would have done for exactly the same effect. And generally this is for cheeks, although there is an odd reference in one place to the fact that Elizabeth's maids, Queen Elizabeth's maids, would paint her and sometimes vermilion her nose. Which, really? Has been lost in translation? Because she's really having her nose vermilion. I mean, what on earth is going on there? That's going to be a heck of a look. Another thing you could use, as I mentioned earlier, this Spanish red. What Spanish red is, you could buy quite expensive, beautiful, soft red leather from Spain, which had been dyed and treated in a particular way, which was a beautiful colour, but the red came out really easily. So what you'd do is you'd buy a piece of this red leather and then you just rub it like that. And between the rubbing action, I suppose, and the actual red dye coming out, that would be a way of getting leather dye on your face, basically. By the late 17th century, it doesn't even have to be a powder necessarily. They have basically invented makeup sticks, makeup crayons. You could mix it with plaster and or with some sort of wax or fat to make something that was more like a modern cosmetic application. Nonetheless, if you look at pictures of the time, this kind of very white face with very red just cheeks there, it looks a little comical to us now, certainly in the extreme way that it's done. And it becomes a bit more comical when you see the versions which include little beauty spots, little black beauty patches, which are a late 17th and early 18th century fashion, mostly. Earliest mention in England, 1653. And you wouldn't just necessarily have one or two, you could have 10 or 15 on your face if that was your thing. And you imagine having 10 or 15 little black dots and other shapes all over your face. Again, it's going to be quite a look. They could be, depending on whether you buy them, you could buy them from peddlers or buy them from posh shops, or whether you make your own. They could be taffeta, velvet, silk, paper, leather, usually black, but occasionally another bit of that lovely red Spanish leather could be used. Again, it could be about hiding a scar, hiding a smallpox mark, or it could be hiding the damage to your face that is actually being done by your makeup in the first place. So if your makeup has left a mark on there. And then, of course, it just becomes fashion. They're also known as mouches, which is the French word for them, which is also the French word for a fly. So it's as if a little black fly has landed on your face. Oh, I like your new flies. Very strange. And they come in lots of different shapes as well. There's a real peddler's song from the 1640s. Goes, here patches are of every cut for pimples and for scars. Here's all the wandering planet signs and some of the fixed stars. Already gummed to make them stick, they need no other sky nor stars for Lily thought of you to tell your fortunes by. Lily being I think the astronomer royal at the time. So he can tell your fortunes by the stars on your face. The Gentlewoman's Companion gives us a bit more detail as to what these different shapes could be. They say, these patches are cut out into little moons, suns, stars, castles, birds, beasts and fishes of all sorts, so that their faces may be properly termed a landscape of living creatures. The vanity and pride of these gentlewomen hath in them in a manner abstracted Noah's Ark. Lots of little animals on their face. Such a weird thing, isn't it? In the 1650s, there was even a fashion for tiny coach and horses on your face. Although you have to imagine how finely cut that's going to be to actually look anything like a coach and horses, or how big it's going to have to be on your face to look anything like a coach and horses. But that apparently was a thing. And they have different names depending on where on your face they are. All of them are beauty spots or mouches, but if it is at the corner of the eye, it's called a passion. If it's in the middle of your cheek, it's a finery. If it's by your nostril, it's a boldness. If it's at the corner of your mouth, it's a kiss. And those are not just random names for things. They are concepts. You are signalling something about yourself. You are signalling your own personality, basically. So the coquette, for instance, is at the very corner of the lip, and as the name suggests, it signifies a playful woman. So you can go into a ball and people can read your character. Things like flirtatious, cheerful, discreet. You can put it on the right place to suggest that you are actually a discreet woman, which is amazing. I mean, you could lie for a start. If it was heart-shaped, you could put it in different places to indicate whether you were not looking, available, engaged or married, just by where this little heart was on your face. In Queen Anne's time, depending where you put things, it might indicate something about your political perspective as well. So yeah, that's a really weird thing that's been almost completely forgotten, that ladies in society would do this quite as regularly as seems to have been the case. Finally then, you must look after your hair. If you're keeping your own, of course, and we'll come to that in a moment. If you're keeping your own hair, well, fashionable women are going to try and wash their hair every week. And there are fashions colour-wise. Obviously, while Queen Elizabeth is around, there is a brief fashion for redheads. But generally blonde is seen as the best, and therefore you get a lot of women trying to lighten their hair. And what you need for that is lye, and you need lemon juice, but then you need sunshine. This, of course, is a bit of a problem because you're trying to avoid getting any suntan on your face at all, but you want your hair to hit the lye. And there are pictures of people wearing sort of a big shade like that with a hole in the top, that all your hair comes out through the hole in the top and then is spread out around this big sort of platter on top of your head, while the rest of you is kept in the shade, but the hair gets maximum exposure all the way around, which is brilliant. And a lock of Lucretia Borgia's hair that survives suggests that she used this method of lemon juice, lye and sun in order to be a blonde. There are other ways of doing it again. Of course, you can use turmeric, but that tends to make your hair a little bit orangey, rather an orange blonde rather than a pure blonde, which may or may not be what you want in life. Another thing that's an issue is that parasites are incredibly common at this stage. You just can't have the levels of hygiene and cleanliness in your house needed to make sure that you don't get any lice or nits or anything like that. And it was an expected job of the woman of the house to comb out the man's hair hunting for lice with a bone or a wooden comb. And they would also make up sort of shampoo recipes or hair washes to help with that. One suggests that you wash your hair with brimstone and vinegar and that will kill them. And actually, yeah, they're not going to like being in amongst a mix of sulphur and vinegar, so might work. But of course this, as I say, is if you keep your own hair. And there's a fair chance you might not. There's a fair chance you might instead, from the 1660s onward, you might settle for a wig. Now, this starts in the 1660s, probably largely because over in France, Louis XV's hair was rapidly falling out to an embarrassing degree. And he, rather than accepting that he was losing a bit up top, made these great elaborate wigs and started wearing them instead. And of course, if the king's doing it, then everyone else is going to follow suit. And suddenly this is normal. Everyone does this, don't they? It's a fashion item. And in the Renaissance court in England, all things were French inspired and French in style, so the wig very quickly makes its way over to England in the 1660s. It took a while before ordinary folk in the street wouldn't laugh at you for your sort of French affectation, particularly since this is men as well, or starting wearing these sort of great big curly wigs. But it does gradually sort of move down. But it is initially associated with this wider trend of fops with their powders and their perfumes. There's also a suggestion I read that some of the people who had their heads very close cropped during the war might be trying to move past that and become more like civilians, more like cavaliers, even more like the other side, more like associated with the royalist side, who always, well, allegedly, it's not actually that simple, had this sort of curly long hair. Not convinced by that, but it's an interesting theory. But wigs are a pain to look after. Pepys in 1663 says that wigs are not yet common. He said he feared he would be laughed at for wearing one, and you know, he's the first trier of everything. But and he did do it, even though he was worried he'd be laughed at. He was also worried that the hair might come from plague victims, because of course the vast majority of it is done with human hair. Occasionally you'd get animal hair, but that's much rarer. So some men, some women actually, would cut off their own hair and have it put into their own wig instead. It's lower maintenance in some respects. You can certainly style it more easily when you're not wearing it on your head, but you don't really want it from plague victims, do you? And you did have to reshape the curls, because it had to be kept in curls. You'd have to reshape that in curlers every week. So you have to imagine all of these houses of these great men having a head-shaped stand in one corner with these long wigs all held in place in curlers. And a lot of men, it was not considered particularly weird to be combing out and carefully untangling your curls in public, particularly if it had been raining, because with it being artificial it would tend to just kind of mat in the rain. They had to be powdered regularly as well, and you could use just plain flour, or you could mix up this thing with like orris and cuttlefish bones and starch and beef bones all sort of ground together and turned into hair powder for you. But the biggest problem with them is they too, much like human hair, are prone, well, they are human hair, like human hair on your head, are prone to nits. Because they can live quite happily in the wig, and then they put it on, and then there's a very there's a fine mesh, and then they can get through the mesh to your head, have a nice nibble, then go back into their nice safe house afterwards. Some people even tried making, sort of sealing up that mesh with a sort of cap of flour and water, but it turns out that's even more uncomfortable than having nits, having this kind of close fitting thing of you know, flour and water plaster on your head, basically. Pepys was furious when he got sent what was described as a new wig by his wig maker, which already was crawling with nits. He was not a happy man. Because of this, you get a whole new job coming into being, which is being a nitpicker. And that's why we talk about, you know, nitpicking being pedantry. The original nitpickers were literal nitpickers, and they would go around, usually there'd be women, they would go around door to door offering to nitpick your wig for you. And quite often the rich might well take them up on that. Initially it's only the rich who are using the wigs, although they do kind of make their way gradually down the scale. High quality ones are expensive enough to be worth stealing. They are quite valuable. And there was a scam going around in the 1670s in London where you would steal someone's wig and run with it, or even that you'd have a lad carried in a basket on somebody's head, who was obviously at the right height then, to just grab someone's, put it in the basket with them, tuck down, close the top of the basket, and the people are not supposed to know who it is that has stolen their wig. I would have thought it would still be obvious, but that's the theory of that particular scam. And also, of course, it means you get quality variation, and that you get first-hand wigs or second or third or fourth-hand wigs, depending on how much money you've got to spend on it. And there's a nice issue with that as well. At Holborn, there was actually something called the dip, which some people say is the origin of the lucky dip, although I'm not entirely convinced, because that could be from anywhere. But the dip, for 3 pennies, It's a barrel, it's a blind thing. You can stick your hand in and take away, at random, one wig. You don't get to put that one back if you don't like it. One wig, that one's yours. That was the lucky dip. Trouble, of course, is if even one of the ones goes in there has nits or lice, before you know it, they're all going to, aren't they? Because they're all in the same barrel. So yeah, that's some of the ways in which you might try to follow the standard of beauty in Stuart times, that you would have these great curling locks, often in styles that involve far more hair than you could actually produce using just your actual hair, unless you were very, very blessed in that department. It would be the hair of several people in one go. White face, red on the cheeks, thin eyebrow. Well, the eyebrow fashion changed. Occasionally it's thin eyebrows, occasionally it's quite chunky eyebrows. There is some suggestion that poor folk are even using mouse fur on their eyebrows, which is something that's also said about Roman times. So when poor people are looking for some fake fur, mouse is apparently the place to go. And yeah, most of it is really, really bad for you one way or the other. Although that could probably be said of most makeup up until really very modern times. And actually you would still find there are some countries with regulations that would still allow the use of some of these products, which is kind of scary. So yes, I will leave you with the suggestion that you should completely ignore Stuart beauty standards and look however you please, and definitely don't put white lead all over your face. Okay? Good night.